Excellency, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome. I hope everyone is doing well and remaining high spirit for our discussion today. My name is Afni and I will be the master of ceremony for today's event. Ladies and gentlemen, today we have here with us His Excellency Vincent Piquet, Ambassador of the European Union to Indonesia and Brunei Darussalam. Welcome, Ambassador. How are you enjoying Bali? Ladies and gentlemen, being impacted directly by the Ukraine war, the European Union's economy is severely challenged. Countries all over the world are clouded by the recession, high inflation, food and energy crisis, widening inequality, and the alarming climate crisis. As geopolitical tension continues to escalate, effective strategies to address these economic challenges are more crucial now than ever. Against this backdrop, we will be listening from Ambassador Vincent Piquet on the EU strategy in responding to the global economic crisis. Today's lecture will be moderated by Ibu Anggia Valerisha. Ibu Anggia starts her journey as a lecturer in Universitas Katolik Parahyangan in 2015. She teaches international communication, globalization of information and media studies, methodology in IR, and theories of IR. Currently, she serves as the head of the International Relations Laboratory, a platform or medium for capacity building and developing student soft skills that provide various training and workshops. Welcome, Ibu Anggia.
Thank you, Afni.
Today, we are also joined by students from universities across the province of West Java, namely President University, Universitas Jenderal Ahmad Yani, Universitas Katolik Parahyangan, and last but not least, Universitas Pertahanan Republik Indonesia. Welcome everybody, and also thank you to our participants who are tuning in on our YouTube channel. Before we start, don't forget to share your moments with us from this ambassador lecture by tagging at FPC Indo and at uni_Eropa on your social media posts. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let's begin today's discussion. Please welcome our moderator today, Ibu Anggia. Ibu Anggia, the screen is yours now.
Okay, thank you, Afni. Hello and good day, His Excellency the Ambassador Vincent Piquet, the FPCI Committee, Afni and Reynaldi, and all participants around Indonesia. Again, I welcome you all on FPCI Ambassador Lecture in cooperation with the Delegation of the European Union to Indonesia and Brunei Darussalam. I'm Anggia and I'm thrilled to be part of this event, so thank you for having me. And I will be moderating this FPCI live webinar of EU Ambassadors Lecture on the EU strategies and responses to global economic crisis. Before we begin, I have a few notes. First one, we suggest you all to turn on the camera or video during the session, so we can or we may look your handsome and pretty face even though it's virtual. Second, please keep yourself muted during the lecture. And this is a live webinar on Zoom as well as on FPCI YouTube channel. And it's also being recorded to be available for post-event viewing. Lastly, for all the participants who are attending this event, don't worry, e-certificates will be provided. Yes, I think we can begin now. So as it been mentioned by Afni that being impacted directly by the war happening in the European Union's region, the economy of EU is severely challenged. Countries all over the world are clouded by the recession, slowdown, high inflation, food and energy crisis, and widening inequality. So as geopolitical tension continues to escalate between Russia and Ukraine, it is needed for EU and the region to have effective strategies to address to those economic challenges. So what is the actual condition within European countries today, and how has the war affected the EU region, and what are the approaches taken by EU to overcome these challenges? To know more and to dig more about this issue, We have here with us His Excellency Vincent Piquet, the Ambassador of the European Union to Indonesia and Brunei Darussalam. So let's give the floor to the Ambassador Piquet. Mr. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much indeed, Ivo Angia, for the introduction, and the same to Ivo Afni. Great to be with you once again at the FPCI lecture series, on which we have cooperated with FPCI for quite a while now. The previous lecture was a little while ago. That's all to do with travel relating and meetings relating to the G20, and it also explains why I'm reaching you out to you from Bali, where I'm participating in the ministerial meetings of the G20 taking place last week and this week. Last week we had trade and economy. Yesterday we had tourism, and tonight and tomorrow we have the agriculture ministerial. So all in all, quite a packed program of meetings with, I'm very happy to say, many high-level EU visitors coming out to Bali to attend the meetings, to meet with the government representatives here, and also to meet with their colleagues from other G20 members. The economic crisis of the EU. I'll start by showing you a couple of graphs to show you where we're coming from, and maybe slide one, please. If you look at these graphs, and the one on the left, you see our GDP growth trend over the past couple of years. You see the very deep dip in 2020 during the high peak of the COVID, -7% GDP growth. You see a very fast resumption of growth the year after, and in 2021, 2022 is where we are now. In original forecasts, it would have been roughly at the same height as in 2021. It's half that, so we have lost somehow 2 percentage points of our economic growth, and something similar will be happening in 2023. And the cause of that dip in 2022 forecast has to do, of course, with Russia's war against Ukraine. Similar positive trends we had on our government debt as an EU average. You see it there. There are variations between the different member states, some with rather high debt and others with debt percentage below the average. But the overall trend was very positive. The same for unemployment. We have the lowest unemployment percentage in the EU for many years. So in many cases, some member states are trying to find labor to fill vacancies, and the number of open vacancies is very high. The next slide, please. Our trade, robust growth, you see there over 2021 and 2022, and the forecast for 2023 was likewise very good. The exchange rate caused some nervosity in our markets over the past months, and that all has to do with the uncertainty perceived by traders, by the markets as a result of the war and the energy crisis that was caused is caused by the war. Next slide, please. And this is where the crux of the problem. Here, of course, you see during the COVID times, you see a negative inflation, which is not what we liked, and but we have a very high peak. If you look at the left graph in this year, not been so high for 2 decades, and we expect it to moderate in the next year to about 4%. The cause of this high inflation is very much energy and food. And you see here, very simple terms, the picture of the price inflation for those 2 very important components of any economy and components of the inflation. And that explains very much why we are in a very uncertain time, in a crisis situation, because of course this all hits the citizen, the households. Of course, the higher income households will be able to face this, but for the lower income households, this is a major issue. Energy bills on a monthly basis have gone up by about 40%, even higher. And of course, it makes a big difference if for your gas, your electricity, you pay 200 euros or 300 euros on a monthly basis. The same for food, also a steep increase. So I should show in the next slide, please. I've shown you these graphs to indicate that we had a very solid recovery after COVID, but we see now major uncertainties ahead. The outlook is, of course, very uncertain, if not troubling. What does it depend on? Of course, in the first place, it depends on how the Russian war against Ukraine will develop. How long will it last, and how intense, how severe it will be. Secondly, we have definitely an energy war waged by Russia against the EU. While we turn away from Russian gas, it's a fact that they are turning off the tap faster than we turn away. And that is all to do with Russia wanting to strong arm us into in their favor. The economic downturn is there. The social downturn I've already mentioned and illustrated with the inflation graphs just now. And the other big uncertainty is, of course, the impact of the war on world food security. Not so much is this relevant for the EU. We have a very stable situation if it comes to sheer food security. We have a lot of capability, production capability domestically. But of course, that is the problem for the rest of the world, particularly in the developing world, in Africa and Asia, that we have to face. And if already now with the difficulties of the food export from Ukraine, but certainly also potentially a very risky situation for next year. And that depends on, is very much linked to the trouble of getting fertilizers to countries, to the farmers, to help them plant their crops for 2023. I'll talk very briefly with our approach, both internal and secondly, external. Next slide, please. And of course, energy is the big issue, the big topic that we face. And Our goal is very simple. Russia used to be a very reliable supplier of oil and especially gas. And it reached, as regards gas, 40%, about 40% of our overall gas consumption in the European Union. Very high, and in fact, once you're no longer friends with a supplier, it is definitely too high, and there's overdependence. So our firm drive is to cut our dependence on Russian oil, Russian gas. Oil is easier than gas. It's a very liquid world market. There are mammoth tankers floating about the oceans continuously, and for that fuel we are relatively at ease. Gas is much more difficult because the imports of gas happen through pipelines constructed over years, and that supply source, of course, you can't turn around overnight. Nevertheless, we will, and we have, simply because of the fact that Russia has turned off the tap in most of our large pipelines, we have already started sourcing fossil fuels from other countries. Been quite successful at that. For oil, as I said, that was not so much of an issue. For gas, it was a challenge, of course, but somehow or other, through effort and through determination, we managed to get new gas supplies through the pipe from Norway and Algeria, and major LNG supplies from countries such as the United States, Canada, and Qatar, as well as Egypt. So that is going well. Our gas reserves are almost full. Last week we stood at 85%, which was above the target we had set ourselves a month or two ago. The second big shift is the one to renewables and to hydrogen. We have increased our targets here. We used to have a target of 40% renewables by the year 2030. The target is now 45% by the same 2030. And that is, how do we do that? A massive investment in wind power, especially in solar power, not only the big solar farms, but also the solar panels on rooftops of cities, households in cities. And we are also investing in water pumps, the hot water pumps, and lastly, investing heavily in the production of hydrogen, which is still a little bit at the starting point, but we are confident that through joint investments, through a joint program, member states to create capacity, that we can also bring that share of hydrogen in our energy mix up fast. The other objective is, of course, very simple. It's to use less. And it is the target is that we reduce consumption by households and by industry, as well as transport, by 5%. So all sorts of measures, investment in insulation of housing, more effective energy grids, but also by changing our behavior, and our behavior alone, the economists have calculated, can reduce consumption of gas by 5%. And that is 5% less consumption, less import need. And secondly, it's of course a saving for the wallet of the households. We are also still purchasing gas abroad, but in general, the measures that we are taking right now are completely in line with our big climate policy, and that's called Green Deal. I've spoken to FPCI about that at an earlier moment. I will not go into detail, but the goal is very simply to be carbon neutral by the year 2050, 50, with a whole range of measures in all areas of economic life, as well as in the households. So that people have asked, the energy crisis in the EU, will it diminish our objectives regarding the greening and the decarbonization of our economy? I can tell you in simple terms that that is not the case. If anything, it will speed up our performance on meeting the targets we set ourselves for the year 2050. So that's energy. Next slide, please. Inflation, high prices, electricity and gas. Of course, that is it's a terrible burden for the households. It causes social dissatisfaction. It causes social action, demonstrations, and so on. Something which, of course, Russia loves to see in our streets. Destabilizing our societies is part of their plan. So for that reason, but also for the sheer reason of protecting our society, we have to bring down inflation. It's very easy to say that. It's highly complex in the reality, with competing objectives. Central banks, of course, the European Central Bank in particular, will want to raise interest rates in order to push down the money supply to the economy. At the same time, we have still the goal of economic recovery from the pandemic. And of course, for a recovery, for investment, you need money. So we have there a conflicting set of goals. Also, do bear in mind that some of our member states have a high debt burden, public debt. And of course, if the interest rates go up, their interest payments will go up as well. In other words, we have to take that factor into account as well. Nevertheless, the European Central Bank has been rising the interest rate very gradually, and we are no longer in the below zero interest rate situation, but it's slightly above of the 0 point at present. Second, very important factor is that some of our companies are in trouble. They have difficulties paying their bills, to source their inputs at reasonable prices. They have a problem of unpaid bills also from their customers. In other words, we have to look at how we can protect the companies that have become very vulnerable to the price increase for gas, particularly, and electricity. And for that, there are certain schemes for temporary state support to help the companies bridge the current phase. Same for households. Member states have been paying close to 500 billion euros already for households to help them cover the increased cost of living. And that will continue with primarily, of course, money from the member state budgets themselves, but also with a new fund created at the level of the EU. How do we pay for that? For that fund, how do we pursue that further? First of all, by introducing a cap on gas, oil, and electricity prices. This is under discussion right now, and we expect that a proposal for that will be put on the table of the member states at the end of this week or early next. Not easy, neither politically nor practically. How do we actually do that without disturbing the market overly? And we are, of course, not used to this sort of deep intervention into markets, but this is a moment where we have to do things that we had never thought we would be doing ever. One other measure is to put a cap on the revenues, on the profits of certain firms. We have seen that in the power sector, electricity. Some companies are running tremendous profits because of the electricity price is high, while at the same time they are not dependent on higher gas or oil inputs, and that's because they are reliant on renewables. So we're going to find a way to cap their revenues, cap these excess profits, and the idea is to redistribute the money that we gain by doing so to the low-income households. Economists have calculated this will bring us about 140 billion euros. Another, it's very technical in a sense, but very, very important, that the way we calculated benchmarked gas prices was outdated. It was based on essentially on gas from the Netherlands at the time when the Netherlands was a major producer of gas. However, with the introduction of LNG, of course, we have a totally new supply side situation, and which is in terms of benchmarking much simpler, and also more reflecting the actual cost of the overall gas price we are benchmarking. So this is a method that we will be also developing in the coming weeks, and that should, we expect, bring down the gas prices for the consumer. So social action aim is to protect households and companies and the jobs there, but realized through several methods and tools in particularly the gas sector. Next slide, please. Just to repeat that, like Indonesia, the EU was still in the post-COVID recovery mode. We were doing well, but this has now been interrupted. Recall also that, of course, war or no war, the climate crisis goes on unabated. This summer in Europe was tough. Heat wave, which was the hottest ever on record in several of our countries. We had drought. We had a problem with forest fires in several countries: Portugal, Spain, France, Italy, and in particular. So all in all, it means that while we protected ourselves against Russia's the impact of Russia's war, while we try to recover our economy, we must also pursue the greening of our economy. So the Green Deal will go on. There's plenty of money available there under this new funding scheme adopted a year and a half ago, Next Generation EU. The total budget available is 800 billion euros. It's all been allocated to member states. but it's not yet all been spent. There's about 700 billion euros still available for spending on green infrastructure, on developing green industries, and for developing the renewable sector. So we expect that that will be a major jobs and GDP generator. The term strategic autonomy, quite fashionable these days, of course, but it's a term that we used already a few years ago in order to strengthen our capability to act independently and develop independently in the world economy, where at times competition or political tensions make us vulnerable. And what we are busy doing is apply that to the key sectors. Energy, of course, is one example. If you do renewables, then you create more homegrown energy sources. In other words, you make your economy also more autonomous and less vulnerable to the outside. Other topics that we cover, topics of common interest, are the core elements, the core backbone of our future economy, and that is, of course, the battery sector, the microchips, and the other topics of common interest, where the EU member states have agreed with the EU leaders that we must work together and set up common projects to develop infrastructure and capabilities together, and which then is commercialized in our member state markets. Labor, very important to mention that. Recall that what I said earlier, that we have low unemployment and we have shortages of labor in some of our member states. Acute shortages, for instance, the airport of Amsterdam, through which I flew this summer, has major problems of getting their staffing right. And so we need to source labor from elsewhere, from other parts of the country, but also from other member states, but also, that is likely to happen, from outside the European Union. Another aspect is what is hidden in this term revaluation. There is definitely a sense in Europe that over the past years we have been undervaluating labor. Wages have not gone up sufficiently to motivate people to change jobs and to invest in their skills and know-how. So you can expect that in the coming months we will put an emphasis putting the right value on labor in order to attract more people to the labor market, to bring women, and especially into the labor market. They're still a minority, even though we're 50% of the population. So that is another interesting new target. And lastly, foreign trade. We are an open economy. Some people dispute that, but I can tell you that we are. For the large majority of economies around the world, our tariffs for industrial products are zero, also for Indonesia. And for even without an FTA, without a comprehensive economic partnership agreement, for agriculture, we have very low tariffs. Also for Indonesia, palm oil, for instance, comes into our market partly without tariffs and partly over and above a certain threshold. It has a duty of 15%, and that is low compared to, for instance, the tariffs that India applies. But our basic goal remains to strike more and more free trade agreements with third countries, simply to diversify our trade network, to diversify our economic relations externally, and to trade with friends that you trust, also for the long run. So boosting our FTAs with South America, Latin America, as well as in Asia Pacific, in India, with Australia ongoing, as well as with Indonesia, is one of our important policy goals. Next slide, please. This is an interesting slide. You maybe coherence. First of all, to stress that we are the most tightly organized and most coherent regional union on Earth. Very highly integrated amongst our 27 member states in the economy and social policy and everything else. And it's taken 70 years or so to build it up. But there you are. You can't take this for granted, of course. There's, especially in war times like we have now. So we have to continue to invest in that internal coherence, in our internal stability for our sheer survival and for our resilience. We learned that under COVID, just to recall that at the start of COVID, to put it in simple terms, we were in a little bit of a mess, and with individual responses by the member states, that fairly quickly that changed into a common approach to dealing with the pandemic, with the medical equipment, the gloves, the face masks, and with vaccines, and the result is overall very positive. Now we have a war going on, waged by Russia against its neighbor, and that also has prompted member states very much to stick together and maintain a unity in the face of this aggression. Our single market remains our big asset. The European Commission is very strictly monitoring the tightness in the implementation of what we have agreed. It's taking warning member states whenever they fall behind in adopting legislation nationally that was agreed at European level. And the European Commission doesn't hesitate to take member states to court if they repeatedly fail to do their job. So that's one way. The other way is to find a mechanism for emergency situations that allows the member states and the European Commission to react very quickly whenever another emergency were to arise. So making the single market stronger and more resilient. Solidarity. We have differences of GDP between our member states. That's a fact. Some are very rich, others are still in a middle income situation. And we need to, of course, make sure that we protect member states and help member states who need to grow to help them do that in different ways. For instance, as I mentioned, some of our member states have a very high debt burden, and we need to find a way to customize the process whereby they reduce that debt. And it's not a one-size-fits-all situation, but something that is adapted to their capabilities. Solidarity to third countries and citizens. Just to illustrate this, right now, the food crisis in Africa, the price hikes we have provided since after the war started in Ukraine, 140 billion euros worth of food security help to the African countries to help them make sure that they can source the goods, the foodstuffs that they need for their markets and for their citizens. Shared values, frequently in the news, of course, globally, but also within the EU. A union is as strong as the sense of having of countries and people having common values, whereby we approach societal problems, democracy, and so on. This is a priority for the EU. Our President von der Leyen has spoken about it in her annual address to Parliament just 2 weeks ago, and protecting these values, the cornerstones of our union, is a key task. And largely enlargement. Why? Because of course, the EU covers the larger share of the European continent, 27 member states. There's still countries right on our doorstep that are candidate countries for accession. We're also having new candidate countries, namely Ukraine, of course, Moldova, bordering on Romania, and also Georgia. And so enlargement is very much for us a policy to bring stability and growth to the countries concerned, but also collectively make the European continent, the wider European continent, stronger, more stable, peaceful, and prosperous. So as you may have read, enlargement is a new top priority which we would like to push forward. That is our internal action with a for the EU with a reference to our neighboring countries. I then go to the next slide, please. And that is how I started in one of my earlier slides, saying, of course, everything, our success and everybody's success in facing the economic crisis caused by the war is by Russia stopping the war. And so that is the goal of everybody. And regions and countries pursue this in different ways. But if I listen to speeches in the G20 this week and previous weeks, then I think this is the overall consensus that this war has to stop. And you remember that early this year, the 141 countries in the UN voted a resolution to that effect, deploring Russia's war and asking Russia to withdraw its troops and to respect the sovereign borders of Ukraine, borders which Russia incidentally had itself recognized in the 1990s. So for the EU, steadfast support for Ukraine in all sorts of ways, financial, basically balance of payments, paying salaries, etc., military, humanitarian, inside Ukraine, but also the 4.5 million Ukrainian citizens that have fled their country and have entered the EU. They are within the EU, and where they can work, they can get medical aid, their kids can go to school. 4.5 million people, imagine that. Economic support for Ukraine, for instance, we are busy connecting Ukraine even before it joins the EU with our single market to make the economy function more easily. in all areas to make the interconnections between their electricity grid and ours. And lastly, Reconstruction. Too early to start, probably, but this is a massive job ahead. How much will it cost? Nobody knows. Some wild estimates are floating about of 600, 700 billion US dollars, massive amounts of money. Who does it? Who pays for it? And when? That is, of course, a key question. So support Ukraine is one. Secondly, eroding Russian war capability. There are sanctions. Some people have said they don't work. Well, the evidence is there, they do work. And we see the indications in all around the Russian economy. The financial market, stock exchange last week was at its lowest point. The Russian economies, companies are unable to source the international financial markets. They're unable to source microchips. Anything that can be used for keeping up their war capability is under sanction, or we will bring it under sanction. There's new sanctions being discussed right now for decision making, probably the next week or the week after. So our goal is very much to isolate the war economy from the world economy and undermine the war capability. Another key fight is on the war is the information war, or rather disinformation war. We have here in Russia a very strong opponent. They are much better at disinformation, much better at falsehoods than we are. We don't lie so much, and we have free press to find out when leaders publish, when leaders go beyond the pale. Fighting disinformation is essential inside the European Union, where of course the Russian disinformation machinery is fomenting social unrest, but also outside the European Union, and we see that in different ways. For instance, the whole discourse, the Russian discourse about sanctions, the EU sanction, they say they are targeting agriculture, agri-food, wheat, etc. Fertilizers. Well, I tell you this, they are not. None of our sanctions target agriculture, wheat, fertilizers from Russia. And but this is a falsehood that Russia is spreading at some point amongst the African countries. And so we have to engage the countries in Africa to make clear that this is not the case. We continue to fine-tune our sanctions package, because it is true that sometimes, of course, in this difficult situation in the economy of sanctions and so on, companies are risk averse, and they interpret legislation in a stricter sense than what it was meant for. And we have been, over the weeks and months, we have been fine-tuning whatever inclarities that people perceived. Lastly, the foodstuffs export. Crucial is, of course, the deal helped and mediated by the UN and by Turkey for the wheat exports from Russia, from Ukraine to the world, and also that's ongoing, the export of fertilizers from Ukraine as well as Russia to the world through a pipeline from southern Russia to Odessa in Ukraine. And this has been quite successful. Again, a lot of disinformation from the Kremlin, alleging that the EU was gobbling up everything that came out of Ukraine. Well, have a look at the Eurostat statistics and you will see that our food imports over the past months have decreased by by 8% rather than increased. So, but it's a sort of thing we have to counter time and again. But safeguarding that wheat export deal and building a real wheat deal on fertilizers is essential. And fertilizers, of course, particularly if you look to the next the production of next year. Lastly is, of course, what it is all about. The war has to stop and Russia has to withdraw. That's one. The bloodshed has to stop. That's one, of course. But the fundamental solution to Russia's war has to be a diplomatic one, a total revamping and re-establishment of the relations between Russia and Ukraine, negotiating and finding solutions for whatever problem, real problem, objective problem there are with Russian-speaking people in Ukraine or what have you. That is something that needs to happen, but right now I'm afraid it's still too early to do that in earnest. Okay, that was my last slide. One but last one is the propaganda slide. That for your maybe later on colleagues at PCI, you show that once again so that people can take note. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let's give it applause with the emoticon in Zoom, of course. Okay, thank you, Ambassador Pickett, for the insightful updates. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me share a few points from the Ambassador's presentation. First, so it can be seen that there's an uncertain economic situation. In fact, yeah, in European Union, such as from the GDP growth that has been generally slowing down across Europe, as well as with the exchange rate between the US dollar and euro. And there is also high inflation rate and most on energy and food sectors. Second, there have been approaches taken into account by the EU. It covers on, for example, first on energy aspects, such as through cut dependency on Russian oil and gas, as well as to cut consumption, particularly on the household and industry sectors. Second, on the social action, it aims to protect households, company, and jobs in EU. And third, in pursuing economic recovery, particularly post-COVID, addressing climate change, autonomy on energy sectors, together with laborers and also important goals on foreign trade. The most interesting one, of course, about how EU maintains the coherence, solidarity, and stability within the 27 members include the enlargement issue of the EU. Lastly is about EU efforts to stop Russia's war. In this case, EU will continue to support Ukraine, meanwhile keep using any kind of diplomatic tools to address the issue. Okay, so let's continue to the Q&A session. There will be 2 rounds of Q&A session, and in the first round, we will read the questions that have been submitted from the registration form. Meanwhile, for the second round, we would like to hear the students or participants to ask questions directly to the ambassador. So be ready to use raise hand feature to ask the question. But of course, all the participants are welcome to submit questions through Zoom chat box and also YouTube live chat. But make sure that you state your name, your affiliation, and the question clearly. To begin with, I would like to raise a question to you, Mr. Ambassador. We have known that Europeans' economy, as well as United States, the Western regions, have been the reference for the economy globally. So it may be said that the economic or energy policy taken by the EU will affect the whole world. What do you think about this, and how does the EU ensure that the global economic crisis can be minimized in the future?
All right. Well, first of all, let's countries around the world experience the impact of the war in different ways. And you can easily imagine that us bordering on Ukraine and on Russia, we feel this impact very, very much more directly and fiercely than people are further away, for instance, Indonesia. We have to, as EU, we have to take more measures and go deeper in our response than most other countries, simply because of where we are. And we are doing it. We are responding as much as we can, as fast as we can, in energy, in keeping inflation, bringing inflation down, and in our support for Ukraine. For countries further away, of course, the main impact is one of the energy prices globally and the food prices globally. Now, here, there's no two ways about it. There is an impact. Nobody can escape this. This is a crisis, a war by a Security Council member, with threats of nuclear power, use of nuclear weapons, that reverberates around the world and that creates instability around the world, politically, but also in the economies. So it's no wonder that also in Indonesia, even 2 months ago, when I traveled to some of the islands other than Java, people mentioned this to me. Small, medium-sized enterprises in the food sector mentioned that they were struggling with the wheat prices, for instance. Now, how to deal with that? Of course, very much the track that we have been following, with making sure that the export of wheat, of these millions and millions of tons of wheat that were locked up in the silos in Russia, that export can continue and can expand. UN, Turkey helped broker that deal. President Putin criticized it for whatever reason two weeks ago. But if that were to break down, of course, then everybody would be in severe trouble globally. So we must work together on preserving and improving and speeding up the exports of wheat from Ukraine. I've mentioned the fertilizers. Russia used to be a major fertilizer producer, and it exported one of the main ingredients of fertilizers via a pipeline from Russia to Ukraine. That pipeline has been shut ever since the war started. Now, the UN is trying to negotiate the reopening of the pipeline, and that is, of course, a vital interest of everybody, us in Europe, but the whole world. If that fertilizer supply doesn't come onto the market, then you lose about 20% of the main ingredients of fertilizers, and then large parts of the world will suffer food insecurity, if not famine. So here we have to stick together as a world community to push the agreement for fertilizer trade through. On energy, oil, as I mentioned, is a very liquid market. So there, the prices are high at the moment, but there's plenty of oil in the world. The OPEC countries are even reducing output. don't think we like it so much, but because it does keep the price up, which is their goal. Yeah, it's something that we deal with. Gas is more difficult, as I mentioned, and here what we can do, we know what we have to do at home. Let's say that first. Secondly, elsewhere in the world, we have to simply try and see how we can help the LNG market develop. For instance, in Indonesia, there is a growing LNG sector. There may be a need for investment there. Not sure if there's European firms interested in doing that right now, but certainly it would be good if the gas fields here were developed further, particularly to, of course, to take steam off the kettle here in Southeast Asia and Asia generally. So that's something on which we can cooperate with Indonesia and other Asian countries, I believe. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So EU will ensure that the policy taken into account is beneficial to all, and EU are working on it, right, Mr. Ambassador? Okay. Okay, so let's take a look to the questions from the registration form. We have, Mr. Ambassador, do you want to answer the questions one by one?
Can we three together?
Okay, okay, together. So we've had 4 questions actually. The first one is from Ronald Tampubolon from Universitas Pertahanan, yeah, Universitas Pertahanan Indonesia. He asks you the question, what can Indonesia do in relation to the EU strategy in responding to global economic crisis? That's the first question from Ronald Tampubolon. What can Indonesia do in relation to the EU strategy in responding to global economic crisis? The second question comes from Santalia Christy Lewayan from President University. What is the EU delegation doing in helping Indonesian economy? What sectors will be prioritized in this mission? That's the question. That's the second question, and I will go further to the third question from Emir Saleh from Parahyangan Catholic University. He said that he have read several articles, sir, recently, many of which say that Europe's dependence on Russian energy has turned the war in Ukraine into energy and economic crisis, with prices rising to record highs in recent months and fluctuating wildly. In this case, what will the EU do to keep its citizens warm in the upcoming winter? Okay, that's from Amir Saleh. It's an interesting question though. And the last one coming from Wing Commander Hasan Raza Hashmi from University Pertahanan. Yeah. The leadership role demands sacrificing self-interest, he said. I want to ask for His Excellency's views, Mr. Ambassador, that about which powerful state with a good economy in the EU is ready to take up the leadership role to sacrifice its interest for the benefits of small European economies and to help them come out of this crisis? Wow, that's an important questions, I guess. Okay, so I will give the floor to you, Mr. Ambassador, to answer the questions.
All right. The first question, I didn't catch the name of the gentleman who asked it. What can Indonesia do to support the EU strategy to the global economic crisis? If I summarize it correctly, I think first of all, I think we very much count on Indonesian support for a multilateral and diplomatic approach to ending the war. because that remains the bottom line. And I think President Jokowi has said it repeatedly, the war must end. And so Indonesia is an important player. In Asia, in Southeast Asia, G20 president, incoming ASEAN president. So it is an important player. It has access to the Kremlin. President Jokowi visited Kiev, as you know, in late June, but also the Kremlin. And so using its influence to make clear that for stability, for the sake of the world, for the sake of humankind, this war has to end. Any threats of use of nuclear weapons are absolutely unacceptable. Winding down the war, not mobilization of reservists, but withdrawal of troops, diplomatic, political influence. That is something that Indonesia can bring to the table, and in the time to come. For the economy, I think maybe not immediately particular points of action that I would mention, but the key thing for Indonesia itself would be to stay engaged and to strengthen itself, its economy, and make it more resilient to crises like this one, to make sure that the energy security is there, that the food security is developed and expanded. So that's something that Indonesia can bring to the table. And if it does so, of course, a country of the size of Indonesia, with a population of 280 million almost, of course, is when such action in Indonesia is meaningful and is significant and contributes to the solution for the globe. Use influence as G20 chair, of course, and that is very relevant to mention as well. We're heading towards the G20 summit, 15-16 November here in Bali, and that of course will be a milestone for everybody to see where all this is heading, and whether the Kremlin, Putin, can be brought to reason and stop the war he has started. Second question from Sam Talia. What is the EU delegation doing to help the Indonesian economy? I mean, the EU delegation in Indonesia, of course, we are part and parcel of the EU institutions. So we work on the overall policies of the EU for our relations with Indonesia. And there's two big topics on our agenda. One is to negotiate the free trade agreement called SEPA, and that's our top priority. We have good progress, but honesty makes one say that progress is too slow and we have to speed up. And for that reason, our vice president was here last week, also met with senior government ministers to discuss that, and we hope that we can accelerate talks for this free trade agreement between Indonesia and us. And when we do that, when we realize that agreement, then we will have an extra GDP growth for Indonesia, and we have extra jobs for Indonesia as a result of it. The economic studies that we've done ourselves, but also the World Bank show that very clearly. The second big priority for us is the green agenda. Indonesia is a biodiversity superpower. It's a commodity superpower. It is, in terms of CO2 production, also a superpower, I'm afraid. So we have plenty of scope for cooperation, where it's reducing carbon in the economy, pushing the renewable energy sector, or whether it concerns the promotion of sustainable production in the commodity sector, the natural commodities, palm oil, rubber, coconut, coffee, etc. Those are the big ticket items. Not easy, and it's sometimes controversial. Of course, we have still a WTO case filed by Indonesia before the WTO's dispute settlement panel. So we still need to find a good consensus on that. But I do believe that there is lots of common ground between the approach of Indonesia and ours. So I do think that on the forest, on commodities, as well as on renewables, we can make common joint progress, partly with know-how and technical cooperation, partly by simply promoting investment by the European companies, the renewable energy sector, the consultancy sector. They know the trade. They've worked for 4 or 5 decades on the same matters inside Europe. So we have plenty of expertise for carbon pricing and for running the carbon stock market, which has been functioning in the EU on the whole quite successfully. The third question from Emir: how are we going to keep our citizens warm during the European winter? Of course, this is the crunch question. No heating in the households. If there were blackouts of power, of course, it means social unrest. It means suffering. It means all sorts of problems to the functioning of our society. So this is a very, very important task, a basic task. Now, I believe we're on the right track. We have made sure, even over the past couple of months, that our energy stocks, particularly gas reserves, are well filled. We are buying gas and oil on the world market. We've been quite successful to increase supplies, contracts for them. We are pushing hard on saving. So people back in Europe will have to do something about their own behavior, reduce the heating by a degree, instead of 22 and 21 or maybe 20, I don't know, degrees Celsius, and public transport rather than take the car, and very practical things like that. It is doable. I know it. We did it once before in our history in 1973 when we had the oil crisis, and from one week to the next we were without oil from the Gulf states, political reasons, and we did it. We managed to cut ration oil usage in a way that to make sure that our economy and our society continue to function. And I'm sure something similar is about to take shape in Europe. So that we, in other words, from the crisis, we create an opportunity for finding a new way forward on energy independence and for the renewable sector. And that is good for the climate, but bottom line, it's good for the citizens because they need a nice warm house when they celebrate their Christmas in late December. And last question from the wing commander from the Defense University. Which leadership state can bear the burden for pulling the EU through, or particularly the so-called weaker member states? You know, in a union of 27, we have large member states and we have smaller ones, or very small ones even. We have ones that are very affluent and others who are still at the middle income, upper middle income level. And we have doctored out over the past decades a system whereby there is a very steady and regular redistribution of finance of resources from the strongest member states to the weaker ones. It's a system that works. It goes to budget transfers. It goes through policy measures that favor the smaller member states, for instance, in this or that sector. And so, whereby I want to say that, yes, of course, we need, in any union, you need leaders. In a football team, you need a captain. You need this one or two brilliant players that can score the goals and or keep them out of the ball out of your own goal. So you need that in ASEAN. You need that in the European Union as well. And this is a natural process of politics, of leaders coming together, of drive of member states. But at the end of the day, it is the system, a calibrated system of laws, of financial flows, of policy measures that makes us work internally and also externally. In our foreign trade, we will always make sure that the interests of small countries are taken care of or respected in striking foreign trade deals, or when designing a new agreement on digital data transfer with the third countries, etc. So now, who that leadership state is, or states, who these leadership states are, Wing Commander, I let you decide for yourself.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I think that's all for the first round of the Q&A session. Let's move to the second round. I will invite those who have questions to ask directly to the ambassador. So please raise your hand. Although I have several questions also in my table, right? Any questions from the virtual meetings, Zoom? Okay, can I invite then Janaka? Janaka, are you here with us? Not yet. Okay. Again, I will ask you, all participants, do you have any questions that will... Okay, we have Aski Farhana Sution from President University. Please, Aski, what's the question?
Good afternoon, Your Excellency. I wish to ask a question, first of all. So I will give you a briefing. So Russia is somewhat losing part of the battle on Ukraine, as seen on the latest news. And lately, I've seen that the member states are quietly trying to lightly lift some sanctions on like Russia's prohibition on coal and other Russian commodities. So what made you, Your Excellency, to think that the reason behind the liftings off of these sanctions? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Um, Mr. Ambassador, we have also one more question. I see Sheriff Aremu. Okay, Aremu, please.
Thank you for this opportunity, and thank you, Ambassador, for your presentation. Permit me to ask two questions. The first one is in relation to the energy and the social action by the European Union. The energy management and the energy management policy and social action by the European Union is a laudable policy direction towards self-sustenance of the European Union. And this policy also help in moving away from Russian dependency. My question now is it worth a war to achieve these feats? After all, EU once benefited immensely from Russia through energy trade and commodity trade. What about EU considering Russia as a member of EU, thereby bringing their prowess and might to add to the achievements EU already attained? That's my first question. The second question is, it is obvious that the war in Ukraine contributed to the current economic crisis being experienced. And to this effect, the United Nations successfully facilitated a safe corridor for continuous supply of grains from Ukraine through negotiation with Russia. What is your view, sir, on EU considering United Nations facilitated negotiation with Russia as a cost-effective strategy to end this unfortunate war in Ukraine, as a means to an end or to reduce the global economic crisis the world is experiencing now? Thank you, sir.
Okay, Mr. Ambassador, I will give the floor.
Right. First of all, the question from ASCII about the possible lifting of sanctions. Well, you know, we are not going to lift any sanctions until we reach our goals. Our president said it 2 weeks ago in front of the parliament, and we are adding sanctions rather than take them away. This is costly. It has led, for instance, our drive away from Russian gas has led us to higher gas prices for ourselves. And but that's something we have to suffer because we do not want to be again in an indefinite future in the same position that we are being held by unfriendly leaders in Russia. So there's not going to be any sanction lifting until our goals have been reached, and that is an end to the war, a withdrawal of troops, Russian troops from Ukraine, and respect for the Ukraine's internationally recognized borders. What we will see is some fine-tuning to allow individual member states to handle all of this. You know, easy to imagine that for a landlocked country like Hungary or Slovakia, things are tougher than for a country that has LNG ports. And that has good connections with pipelines to Norway, for instance. So that is something that we have already fine-tuned in order to make sure that these countries, these member states, do not suffer unduly as a result of the sanctions. So that is the fine-tuning we have, and that concerns oil, that concerns gas, and that concerns some coal. However, most of the coal that the member states have bought temporarily comes from elsewhere instead of Russia. I hope I answered your question. Secondly, the question from Sharif. Russian membership of the EU. Now, I think that is just not on the cards. You know, we have a war going on by a country that has chosen what methods of aggression and threats and disrespect of law that stands diametrically opposed to everything that the EU stands for. We are a law-abiding group of countries. If you don't have laws with 27 countries and you don't have respect for laws, then of course you get crises and you fall apart. So multilateralism, integration, compromising, avoiding conflict is what we are about. Do not forget that the EU was born after the Second World War, a horrible war, and it was always meant, set up as a peace project. Now, and we have succeeded in that. Grown gradually, bit by bit, from 6 to 9 to 12 to 15 to 23, and now then 27. So Russia is not on the same planet in that sense, and so we have to work with Russia in different ways, and it is possible. It's as soon as peace was established and there was respect for international law by Russia. And of course, we would have every interest of working together with Russia closely. We used to have strong relations with Russia within certain limitations, maybe, but still, we have so many of our member states neighboring Russia. The interpersonal family links across the border. There was trade happening and so on. Russians were visiting Europe for tourism. So we have every interest to repair the damage and to rebuild our relations with Russia once there's peace and once there is a negotiated settlement to this war. But as I said, we're not there at this moment. The Russian president's statement, decisions to start a mobilization of 300,000 reservists is not a message of peace. It's the opposite. His threat of the use of nuclear weapons is horrendous and is something that no one on earth can tolerate. And so that is something that we have to face. It's a reality. And we have to work very, very hard together to make sure that that doesn't happen. The wheat corridors, and I mean this. I think that is has been for the third countries the main relief we've got so far. The Ukrainian wheat was locked up. 25 million tons of wheat was in the silos, about to rot away, and so the priority was to get that wheat flowing. It is flowing successfully. The two sides have so far respected that. There was critical remarks made by Putin the other day, which I fail to understand, because the system functions and the wheat is going to whom it was intended for. It doesn't go to the EU. We are importing less wheat than now, or have been over the past couple of months than we did before. So we are not taking the wheat that is meant for particularly the third countries in Africa and Asia. So maintain that, continue that, expand that, also to fertilizers. That is a key policy goal. If we don't realize that together with the UN, with other partners, Turkey, whoever, Indonesia, if we don't realize that, then we will have a food crisis on our hands next year. So it's a top priority for us at this moment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador. I think we have still one more question. I've seen Janaka Ranawira raise hand. Please, Janaka Ranawira, the floor is yours.
Yeah, good afternoon, MC. Thank you for the opportunity. His Excellency, thank you for the interesting presentation on EU strategy in responding to the global economic crisis. I'm Janaka Ranawira from Defense Diplomacy Training Master's Program in the University, Defense University of Indonesia. Sir, during the presentation, I have two questions, two part of the questions, mainly related to your presentation slide. As most of them in the media and the other the analysts, what they are predicting about the Russian-Ukraine war triggered and prolonged due to the NATO and EU failed in their confidence-building measure to prevent the war from the beginning during the initial stage. So I like your comment on that. And same as during the presentation, one of your slides mentioned that the stopping Russian war. So your first one is describing the all the support your EU and the NATO is giving to the Ukraine, and diplomatic measure is the second option, as what I see as per your deliberation. So if you look at it in the present perspective, the challenges what EU and the whole world is facing.
I'm sorry to interrupting you, Janaka Rawira, but can you deliver the clearly, as clear as simply question to the Mr. Ambassador, please?
Okay. If the war is dragged for giving the challenge to the security and economic implications, and it will directly affect to the European Union and to the whole world. I like your opinion on this. Thank you, sir.
All right.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, Mr. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jana, for these two interesting questions. Yeah, your first question about NATO and EU having failed in their confidence building with Russia. First of all, very important to stress that EU and NATO are not the same. NATO is a military alliance. the EU is not a military alliance. We are a union of sovereign, 27 sovereign countries to build a community that have built a community in Europe and to do what it takes to make it happen. Mostly it's economic, that's how it started. We expanded to social, to other policies, environment, transport, research, education, and over the past 10 or 15 years, we have developed a defense identity. It's defense, it's not military. I think it's all terminology, but it is important, nevertheless, to stress that difference and to stress what we are about. Have we failed in confidence building? I guess so. I guess so. We have not clearly come to a point now where there's a total failure of our relationships with Russia, and Russia is at war on the European continent. So something went wrong. Now, where the failure was exactly, our position is very clear. The failure was in the Kremlin, and having watched the actions of Russia over the past decade, starting, of course, with the annexation of Crimea, totally illegal. Continuing with the annexation of parts of the Donbass region and Luhansk region inside Ukraine. It's totally illegal. Now trying to give that a legal veneer by fake referenda, etc. So the problem and the aggression is coming right now from the Kremlin, and that's where the solution has to come as well. Now, that's our steadfast line. Russia started this war. You can talk about circumstances and have interpretations, but the war started by Russia, and Russia is the one who can end it. It was not Ukraine who started this, but it was Russia, and Russia should stop it and withdraw. And then once that happens, then you can start talking about this diplomatic solution. It's the last point in my slide, but it doesn't mean that's unimportant, not at all. Diplomacy has to broker the solution, has to negotiate solutions, lasting solutions, once the conflict, the war is over. And once the peace has come down, that is a moment where we could start talking, first of all, the long-term relationship between Ukraine and Russia, but secondly also how we reconfigure this broken continent, once again broken, that of Europe, and find out what our new relations with Russia can look like. That's not easy. It's going to be very tough. Trust is low, so Russia wanted to demilitarize Ukraine. It has achieved the opposite inside Ukraine and also inside Europe. So we have to stop Russia in its current campaign, and so that we can come back to some sort of situation where we can try to reconfigure that relationship. And that's my, I repeat myself a little bit, but I lived and worked in Russia for 4 years in the early 2000s, working for the EU. And I have a great respect for the country, for the people, for the culture. I admire the landscapes and everything, and the cities, and there's a lot of I have a personal goodwill. Now there are millions of Europeans, EU citizens who have the same, who feel the same about it. But right now, there's no that sort of relationship. The connections, they have been broken, and it will take time to reconfigure them, and to again create a climate where trust can develop and hopefully one day will flourish. It's a tremendously difficult time for Europe, and for Ukraine, of course, in the first place, but for the EU countries as well. We're suffering from this war. 4.5 million Ukrainian refugees on our soil. Now, imagine that in Indonesia, how that would be seen and experienced. We're doing it, and there's tremendous solidarity from our citizens to the Ukrainians that has made this work. And we have economic pain as a result of this war, a war that we didn't choose, but we're suffering. So we have to also, for our own economic survival, energy situation, and our societal integrity, we have to make sure that this war ends. And unfortunately, for the time being, it seems that Russia is intent on carrying through. That's a reality we have to accept, or as a likely path, rather than that we are able to look forward to a faster resolution of the conflict. Diplomacy is vital at the UN level. There's now the UN General Assembly happening in New York. All leaders were there. And so that is one source. G20, Indonesia's presidency there. We hope that Indonesia can contribute to a solution through its position as chair of the G20 and its access to the leaders in the Kremlin, and work our way forward in that way. I hope, Jenna, I answered your question.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Ladies and gentlemen, due to time limitation, I must end the Q&A session. We are sorry for not taking all the questions to be answered, but I think we can continue to observe on how EU and, of course, the rest of the world, I mean the governments, working on the challenge on global economic crisis. Of course, we hope that we have the better condition on our global economy, and I agree that diplomacy are vital in this case. So I think this is the end of the Q&A session, but I would like to invite for the ambassador for final remarks. Please, Mr. Ambassador Pickett, to give any closing message. Yes.
I've spoken a lot already, so I don't wish to add a lot. My main message to students, many of you undergrads, graduate students, postgrads, is be critical. And there's a lot of, we've seen a lot of disinformation, Russian disinformation, falsehoods floating about on the internet and social media. Don't trust what you read. Be critical, seek different sources, seek multiple sources in order to get a objective understanding of the situation. Disinformation, as I said, is something that is hard to fight. The Kremlin is a lot better at disinformation than we are, and hence my recommendation to everybody to be critical and critical thinkers and support a multilateral solution to this horrible problem.
Okay, well said, Mr. Ambassador Pickett. Okay, so it looks like we've covered the main items on the agenda. Thank you for all the participants. Thank you for the questions. Let's give up applause to all of us. Okay, so I think that's all, and I hand over to you, Afni.
Thank you, Ibu Anya, for an excellent moderating, and thank you, Ambassador Pickett, for the insightful lecture and for extending your time as we are supposed to end at 3:30 Jakarta time. We hope you enjoyed the discussion as much as everyone here did. And now let's have some documentation. May I invite everyone to turn on your camera as we will have a virtual group photo shoot. All right, are we ready? Yes. On my count, 3, 2, 1. Please give us your best smile. Once again, 3, 2, 1. One last time. 3, 2, 1. All right, are we good? Yes, okay. And with that, we have come to the end of our EU Ambassador lecture today. Thank you so much, Ambassador. We wish you a safe flight back to Jakarta and hope to see you soon. Also, thanks to all the students and participants who have joined today for your delightful and thought-provoking questions. Before we close, I would like to announce that this year, FTCI will be having Global Town Hall 2022, a North-South-East-West meeting featuring world leaders and leading minds to connect with the global citizens. You can register now at gth2022.com. Thank you and see you again at the next EU Ambassador lecture. Yeah,